As we move up to the upper layers of the OSI stack, specifically layers 5, 6, and 7, things start to get a bit more fuzzy. They get a little bit blurry in terms of the exact function that's being performed at the different layers. One thing that I think contributes to this confusion is the fact that we no longer have protocol data units. Remember, we have protocol data units at the physical, the data link, the network of the transport layer. We have bits, frames, packets, and segments. No PDUs for session, presentation, or application. And remember that historically, the OSI model was not developed with just IP in mind. There were several protocols that were running on networks back in the day, and this was a generalized model meant to apply to just about everything. And again, it's a reference model, it's not a reverence model, so we don't have to necessarily have every network application, every protocol neatly plug in to a single layer. Maybe we don't even have something running at the session layer for a particular application. That's okay. Just realize that this is just a framework that can help us identify how a particular device or a protocol or a service is functioning on the network. With that in mind, let's consider layer 5, the session layer. The session layer is responsible for setting up a session, maintaining that session, and then tearing down the session. When we're setting up a session, we might be negotiating parameters. We might be giving some sort of identifying number to a session. So if we have multiple sessions, we're able to distinguish one from the other because they have different identifying numbers. To give an example, in the voice over IP world, I teach a lot of voice over IP classes. Something that happens at the session layer is we decide on what ports, what UDP ports are going to be used to transmit our voice packets. When we're maintaining a session, we're doing the work of actually transporting the data during the session. And if the session terminates and we restart that session as soon as it terminates, if that's a feature that we have available, that's part of maintaining a session. Bringing it back up if it gets torn down due to some sort of an error. Something else that could happen as part of maintaining a session is that we could have the recipient of our data give us an acknowledgement. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, hold on, didn't we get acknowledgements with TCP down at the transport layer? Oh, that's true, but we could do something in addition to that. Maybe we're not even using TCP at the transport layer. That's a possibility. So be aware that we could, and again, this varies, we don't have to do this at the session layer, but something we might be doing at the session layer is getting acknowledgments from the recipient of our data, so we know the data got there. When it's time to tear down the session, we want to notify all of the parties involved that the session is over. To give an example of a protocol that lives at the session layer, consider NetBIOS. NetBIOS is short for Network Basic Input-Output System. NetBIOS, it's an application programming interface, an API. It's been around for a while. To give you a bit of history, back in the early 80s, shortly after, in fact a couple of years after IBM came out with the personal computer, the PC came out in 1981. Well, in 1983, IBM came out with a LAN technology that they called PC Network. And the protocol that IBM used that allowed PCs to communicate with one another on this LAN was NetBIOS. NetBIOS, though, it was fairly limited. You could only have about 80 devices maximum on the local area network, so it wasn't terribly scalable. So later on, when IBM started using different LAN technologies such as Token Ring, they needed something that would scale greater than 80 devices on a LAN. So there was an enhancement made to NetBIOS, and this enhancement was called NetBIOS Extended User Interface, and we pronounce that abbreviation NetBEUI. NetBEUI is the enhanced version of NetBIOS. Those are a couple of examples for you. NetBIOS and NetBEUI, a couple of session layer protocol examples. Let's move up to the presentation layer. A couple of things that the presentation layer is in charge of include data formatting and encryption. How do we want to represent the data? How do we want to present the data on the network is a way to think of this. For data formatting, let's consider how we would format text. There are different text formatting approaches out there that have been around for many years. One popular type is called ASCII. ASCII, that stands for American Standard Code for Information Interchange. Another way of representing text is using a format called Extended Binary Code Decimal Interchange Code, or EBCDIC for short. Let's say that we had one device that was speaking ASCII Another device wanted to speak EBCDIC. Well, the job of converting back and forth between those different formats, that would be a job of the presentation layer. Encryption can add some security to our transmission. If you're sending me data across a network and we have an eavesdropper, somebody is able to capture packets off of the network, what's to prevent them from reading the data that you're sending me? Or maybe you're sending email out to your service provider and they capture those packets. If your data that you're sending is in plain text, they can just read it. However, what if we did this? What if we scrambled it up? If we scrambled up the data to the point where they could not read it, it would be unintelligible to them. They could not make heads or tails out of that data. However, you and I, if you were sending data to me, we could still read it. We could share the data between ourselves because we might have a certain key. When you get into encryption and security technologies, you learn about different types of keys that you could have. For example, we can have a shared secret key, sometimes called a symmetric key. And it's a big number. You've got the number, I've got the number. The malicious user in the middle that captured our traffic, they do not have the number. And you've got to have that number, you've got to have that key in order to unlock this scrambled up jumble of data that comes across. You've got to have the key to decrypt what has been encrypted, and if that malicious user in the middle doesn't have the key, they're not going to be able to read the data. Encryption, that's another function of the presentation layer. Finally, let's move up to the application layer. At the application layer, we're concerned with things such as application services and service advertisement. And I would say that the application layer is one of the most misunderstood layers of the OSI model. Many people think it's an application layer, so my applications would live here, right? They would think something like Microsoft Excel would live at the application layer because that's an application. Actually, no, that's not the way it works. What does live at the application layer are services that support those applications. For example, think of email. You might be using Microsoft Outlook as your email client. Well, Microsoft Outlook itself does not live at the application layer. However, the generic email service that allows Microsoft Outlook to function, that lives at the application layer. We could say that we had an email service that lived at the application layer, and then we could have different end user applications like Microsoft Outlook or Mac OS X's mail program. They could all interface with that service. Now, I realize we've got specific protocols that make up that service that live at lower layers of the OSI model. We've got maybe POP3, IMAP4, SMTP, but very generically we could say that we've got the email service at the application layer. As another example, if we have a file server on our network and we can go out to a shared folder on that file server and retrieve documents and save documents out there, and our coworkers can do the same thing. We've got this common repository of files that we can access. Well, we could say at the application layer we have a file sharing service. That's a service that lives at the application layer. Now, what about service advertisement? Here we're making a network resource known to devices on the network. For example, let's say that we had a shared printer and we wanted that shared printer to be available to our network clients. Well, that shared printer could make itself known using some sort of a service advertisement protocol announcing itself. For example, if you have an Apple iPad and you have a printer on your network that supports the AirPrint service, you go into your iPad and you have a document or a web page that you want to print, you say you want to print it, and you get a listing of printers that have that AirPrint service capability to which you can print, and you pick a printer and you print your document. That's an example of a service advertisement feature that would live at the application layer.